Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. Before I start getting too deep into the show, I wanted to thank every one of you who listen. Hellbent for Horror just hit another small milestone, going over 10,000 downloads. This growth happened despite how difficult iTunes makes it for anyone to find my show. Even though the word horror is in the title, we rarely come up in a horror keyword search. And yet, without any iTunes foot traffic, we've been growing, slow but steady, and that's all because of you. This is completely grassroots, and your sharing with others is how this podcast has grown. So I want to show my gratitude. I've mentioned that I wanted to do a roundtable show with listeners who contact me to tell me about their passion for horror. Well, the time has come for that. The first wretched roundtable featuring a few of those fans and myself will drop soon. So how did these victims get picked? Outside of finding an oddly decorated cube at a street merchant in Bangladesh, they sent me emails or messages on Twitter and talked about what they like about horror. They told me what their favorite horror film was and why it's their favorite, and gave some detail about themselves as a horror fan. So, if you want to be part of an upcoming roundtable show, send me an email to scott@hellbentforhorror.com or private message me on Twitter at hellbenthorror. I look forward to all the conversations. Now, here in the United States, November is devoted to giving thanks and showing gratitude for friends and family. Well, that's the party line. But deep down, we know the truth. This is the time when we pig out, indulge, feast. It's a celebration of being at the top of the food chain. Or so we think. Because in the circle of life, the feast never stops. Now, some people got grossed out by my last episode. Never underestimate the power of the microbe, real body horror. Real-world creepy crawlies aren't everyone's cup of tea, and I guess the subject got under their skin. Sorry, bad pun. But if you write a guy who does a horror podcast to tell him how gross and unappetizing an episode is, you should realize that's like a standing ovation. And who doesn't like positive, negative reinforcement? So this month, I'm pigging out on Gross Out. When I was a teenager, I had a science teacher who overheard me bragging about kissing girls. He said this to me: "Next time you're kissing a girl, remember that you are sucking on the anterior end of the alimentary canal, a long tube that is half full of vomit and half full of feces." I thought that was so damn cool to find out. I know, gross, right? But I'm fascinated by the human body and the creepiness of the things that can happen to it. Humans have a repulsion and fascination with the body and what can happen to it. Because the body can be so fragile. One accidental blow to the temple can end it all. An invisible bubble in the brain pops, and it's all over. But the body can also be hard to kill. Second and third degree burns can cover a body, and yet it goes on. A disease can cause all the limbs to be amputated, and yet the body goes on. And it's when these horrible things happen that we start to look beyond the flesh and think abstractly about ourselves or our loved ones who suffer. It's what's inside that counts. But I think, deep down, that's what scares us. To be trapped inside this body, this temple, as it crumbles away. To be completely conscious and aware while disease or time or something truly unspeakable eats away at our bodies. So, What's eating you? Now, real-world disease has inspired great horror movies. In fact, one of the last great milestones in horror was directly inspired by a disease. Did you know that the chest-bursting scene from Alien was inspired by writer Dan O'Bannon's real-life struggle with Crohn's disease? Crohn's is an inflammatory bowel disease that affects the entirety of the alimentary canal. It causes severe abdominal pain. It causes fevers, weight loss, and it can be fatal. And it alienates the sufferer because they can't go very far from home base. And there's no cure. Dan O'Bannon had been suffering with Crohn's for years. The disease felt like there was something alive in him, and the pain made him feel his stomach might burst. And then he thought, what if something was alive in there? And with that, one of the most original and most imitated moments in horror film history was born. In fact, that scene is the only reason that producers David Giler and Walter Hill even thought about making Alien. The rest of the script they thought was trash, but that one scene was something new. The impact of Alien on the history of horror is tremendous. It reinvigorated the monster in outer space story, and it combined two ideas into one: outer space as a haunted house, and inner space as a haunted house. Just try to think of horror and even science fiction in a world without Alien. Of course, plenty of low-budget movies ripped off Alien. Where would we be without Parasite in 3D or Contamination or Inseminoid? Inseminoid, how little we truly understand thee. Alien even got ripped off by a terrible made-for-TV movie called The Intruder Within. However, Alien's legacy is far richer and far more important than whatever rip-offs that spawned. Without Alien being a hit, it's quite possible that other highly influential films like John Carpenter's The Thing and David Cronenberg's The Fly might not have even been greenlit. And those two movies open the floodgates for all kinds of creepy crawlies that eat you from inside. I want to talk a little bit about David Cronenberg's The Fly. It's a movie I use to explain why I prefer remakes over sequels. Sequels are kind of like stretching out the Thanksgiving turkey into leftovers. You add some cheese and you make sandwiches until you're sick of turkey, and then it goes in the trash. Remakes are more like you've been given the honor to cook Thanksgiving dinner this year. And you remember that last year, the meal was pretty good, but the turkey was kind of dry. So you keep all the fixings and the table settings everybody remembers, but at the least, you try a different way to prepare the turkey so it won't be dry. But if you're really the adventurous type, you cook a ham instead or a pot roast. You take the risk that some of the folks will be disappointed that there's no turkey. But you also might have started a delicious new tradition. They might remember that Thanksgiving dinner for years. But you got to cook that ham right, or you've got a disaster. Like John Carpenter's The Thing, David Cronenberg's The Fly is a remake of a revered horror sci-fi classic. The 1958 version stars David Hedison as a scientist who creates a matter transporter. He tests it on himself, and he disintegrates in one test chamber and reintegrates in another. Unfortunately for him, a fly got in the test chamber with him. When he emerges on the other side, his DNA and the fly's DNA have mixed, and his head and one of his hands have been replaced with, a fly head and a fly appendage. I will say that the reveal of what Hedison looks like as a full-grown fly is still very effective. It is creepy, and it is well done. And the ending is grotesque as well on a very primal level. But the movie itself is some pretty dry turkey. It's really dated, and once you see what the fly looks like, the rest of the movie is just silly. But David Cronenberg saw the creepy center to that story. See, the original story is told by the wife of the scientist, and we find out she helped the scientist kill himself. It was a mercy killing. So Cronenberg saw that the real horror was watching a loved one slowly die and all the horrible thoughts and choices that a slow death brings to everybody involved. In Cronenberg's version, there's no body part fly head switcheroo. The fly is absorbed at a molecular level by the scientist who's played by Jeff Goldblum. At first, there's no noticeable difference. He doesn't even know about the fly until physical changes force him to do some more research. And in that research, he makes a horrible discovery that these changes have started at the genetic level. By the time there are physical symptoms, it's already too late. And that's what happens to us when we age. We slowly change at the genetic level. Certain genes shut off forever, like hair color, and others that were dormant turn on. David Cronenberg decided to make the transformation a metaphor for the aging process and dying of old age. And Geena Davis, the female lead and the lover of the scientist, becomes our surrogate. The central horror of The Fly is the universal fear we all come to face sooner or later, watching a loved one die. And that's why The Fly is so effective. We empathize with Geena Davis, and we feel Seth Brundle's fear of dying. And we are there through the entire accelerated aging process in all its messy detail. We are grossed out and we laugh at the absurdity, but we can feel the icy fingers of the truth in the story. Cronenberg worked with special effects genius Chris Wallace on the Fly transformation. Wallace and his team worked for 3 months, starting with the final version of Brundle Fly and then working backwards. The first stages of transformation are pretty subtle. They're just rashes and weird hair popping up all over the place. Any guys notice that at a certain age, hair suddenly grows out of your ears or your nose? If not, it's coming. In the next stage, Brundle starts getting sores on his body. Ever wonder why the elderly have black blotches on their faces or bandages on their hands? The skin thins as you age, and it bruises or tears painlessly just by bumping into things. And then the transformation starts in earnest. Wallace created multiple full-body suits with increasing amounts of deformities. Like what happens often at the end of old age, things get cancerous. The Fly was a major turning point for David Cronenberg. Not only was the film a big hit, but also it was the first time that Cronenberg's body horror obsession resonated with mainstream audiences. And it's one of the few horror films that I consider a near-perfect film. But of course, a movie doesn't have to be near perfect or even very good to still have a great idea at the center that creeps you out. I have my personal favorites. I have one that's almost embarrassing to say scared me a lot as a kid. That movie is Irvin Yeworth's 1958 monster movie, The Blob. I'll wait until you stop laughing. Because The Blob is never taken seriously. In reviews from horror sites, they say The Blob looks like melted milk duds, which is not true because The Blob is blood red. It was silicone gel with red dye in it, so there. And yes, the movie is campy, and it is known mostly for being Steve McQueen's first lead role. And it is humorous to see Macho Man Steve McQueen acting like a teenager. And the effects are primitive, and the budget is low, and it has that very silly theme song. Really, nobody expected much from the movie that was originally called The Molten Meteor. But it scared me, and I think The Blob is more influential than people want to admit. Even to this day, I think the idea behind The Blob is pure horror genius. It is so simple. A meteorite crashes on Earth, and when it breaks open, a gelatinous entity oozes out. Like some super acid, it dissolves any living thing near it, mostly people. And as it eats, it gets bigger and bigger. It's a goddamn Lovecraftian elder god. Oh no? You tell me how this slowly growing blob that kills everyone near it is any less Lovecraftian than what's in The Color Out of Space. The blob doesn't think. It's all survival instinct. Now, there's a scientific term called taxis, which means movement towards something. It's used to describe how or why single-cell organisms that don't think move towards food sources. There's chemotaxis, where certain chemicals are food and the organism moves to absorb them. There's phototaxis, which is when organisms feed on light, like photosynthesis. The Blob is thermotactic. It looks for heat, body heat to be precise. It has no malice. It just found an environment that is conducive to rapid growth. And it's scary because it's a silent killer. It oozes, so it doesn't make floorboards creak or knock things over. You never hear it coming. The scary moments are early in the film when it's still small enough to hide in a room. An old hermit pokes the Blob with a stick, and it ends up on his hand. The movie gets tense when he's found by McQueen and his girlfriend on the road. They take him to the town doctor. By then, the Blob has spread up the old man's arm. The doctor can only assume it's some highly corrosive substance. The doctor knows he needs to amputate the arm, and so he sedates the old man. The doctor covers the old man with a blanket, and then he walks out of the room to make a phone call. And then we see what I think is a first in horror history. It was so simple and so effective that it's been copied 1,000 times since. In the background, we see the blanket stir and rise as the Blob consumes the old man underneath without a sound. The Blob was a surprise success in its time, and the theme song was a novelty hit. It also spawned the worst toy of the 1970s, Slime, which was some disgusting green glop that came in a bright green plastic trash can. Yes, I played with Slime. Now, did you know that the Blob was based on a true story? In 1950, 2 Philadelphia policemen saw something sparkly fall from the sky at night. They investigated, and they came face to face with what they described as a purple jelly mass 6 feet in diameter and a foot high. It was pulsating, and when they turned off their flashlights, it glowed like luminescent bacteria. They wrote this in their police report. You can look it up. 2 more police officers showed up, and one of them, inevitably, put their hand in the mass, and it stuck to his hand. But then it quickly broke apart and evaporated. The entire mass itself evaporated within a half hour, but the police swore it was alive, whatever it was. Now, the main premise, something horrible coming to Earth by way of meteorite, or what looks like a meteorite, has been used many times. Even Night of the Living Dead suggested that one of the causes of the dead rising was something that came along on a satellite that crashed. And the main conceit of that alien thing that feeds on us has taken many different forms. Spores or plants or just disgusting goop from an alien weapon have all been Blob variations. Even the egg opening scene in Alien or the alien's acid blood has some Blob DNA. Here's some of my favorite modern variations on the Blob. The creature at the center of director Toby Wilkins' Splinter isn't an extraterrestrial threat. This is a very terrestrial threat, and to me, a very fascinating one. It's an unnamed parasitic fungus that infects and grows on any organic material. And as it eats, it grows outward with these splintery black spikes that look a lot like how freezing water crystallizes when it's viewed under a microscope. We don't get any backstory on this fungus. It just seems to crawl out of the forests of Oklahoma. The fungus escapes the forest through a wild animal and ends up near a remote gas station. And it looks like the animal attacks and kills the attendant. But as the story unfolds and we look back on this incident, we realize the animal was probably already dead, and there was no premeditation or stalking. This was an organism rolling into a random food source. Just like the Blob, this fungus is thermotactic, which means it senses body heat as a food source. But this creature doesn't consume the body entirely like the Blob did. Its food source seems to be the blood inside the body, and the body is just a container. Greasy black spikes poke through the gas station attendant's lifeless body. As the spikes spread, his body is stretched and contorted by the splinters. We see drops of blood on the ground suddenly grow black spikes. Once all of the blood is absorbed, the twisted, spike-covered body just lies there. Until a carload of warm-blooded people drive into the station, and then the attendant's body reanimates and lunges towards them. Maybe lunges is the wrong word. The body is dragged, tumbling and twisting, and the bones break as the fungus propels almost magnetically towards this new food source. Splinter is a mix of the Siege movie, mixed with body horror, mixed with monster movie. Because the bodies of the victims are like gum or toilet paper stuck to the bottom of a shoe. They're just stuck to the splinters of this hungry fungus. And this allows for some really nightmarish visuals. Director Toby Wilkins exploits our body horror anxiety by perverting the human form. He twists and tears the bodies apart, and severed body parts and torsos of different victims combine, just like two droplets of freezing water combine to create one bigger crystal, or one seriously freaky Frankenstein monster. This movie is lean and mean, and the effects rise above the very low budget. The creature is a combination of practical effects, always good for a monster movie, stop motion, and excellent editing. It's also based on a real-life fungus. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I'll just use its nickname, the zombie fungus. You've probably seen the pictures of tarantulas and ants infected with the zombie fungus, where the fruiting bodies burst through the exoskeletons. If not, go look up zombie fungus. Now think of that on a human body, and you have Splinter. There's another great version of the terrestrial monster in Scott Smith's novel, The Ruins. The novel was made into a movie, but quite honestly, the movie wimps out in so many ways and is so very unsatisfying to anyone who read the book. In my opinion, Scott Smith's The Ruins is a modern horror masterpiece. It is real horror. It is intense and full of dread and doom, and it is relentless. There are no chapters in the book, and we never leave the characters, so there is no rest. It refuses to follow conventions we've all grown accustomed to in horror movies. There's no explanation. There's no easy answers. There's no puzzle piece waiting to be found. Most of all, there's no mercy, just like real life. You could take away the monster and still have a harrowing tale of survival and death in the jungles of Mexico. But there is a monster. Just like the Blob, it has no malice, it just found an environment conducive to rapid growth. The story revolves around 6 tourists in Mexico, 2 American couples, and 2 men they befriend at their hotel, a German and a Greek. Matthias, the German, convinces the others to come along with him to an archaeological dig his brother's gone to. It's in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula. Of course, the book starts with all the tropes we're used to in place. The locals tell them not to go. It's a bad place. The leader of the group is arrogant and he wants to prove his machismo. And then they get to the ruins. It's no idealized Mayan temple. It's just a big hill covered in vines and flowers. Heinrich's brother is nowhere to be found, but the Jeep is there. They notice a tent blowing at the top of the hill, so they decide to climb up. It's when they get to the top that everything changes and all bets are off. And what's the monster? Well, I'm not telling you.
Oh, yeah?
Although I will say that when you first find out, you'll probably laugh. I rolled my eyes. But by the end of the novel, you will not be laughing. And that's a testament to Scott Smith's talent and the size of his balls. He's aware of what's come before him and what your initial reaction's going to be. And he goes there anyway. And he goes all the way. He does the hardest thing to pull off in horror. He makes the banal horrifying, and he frightens us by just letting a seemingly normal situation spin out of control. So far, we've talked about creatures that we accidentally stumble upon, only to find out that we are what's on the menu, whether we like it or not. Now, let's talk about creatures that we willfully allow into our bodies, hoping that they will give us euphoria, or grant us beauty, or grant us health. We roll the dice. When it comes up snake eyes, we end up on the wrong end of the food chain. James Muro's ultra-low budget and notorious body horror film Street Trash barely got released in movie theaters in 1987, but it has now become a cult classic. It is also the flashpoint for a very small category of horror films known as melt movies. Yes, melt movies. Now, movies that have a monster that dissolves people, they're not new. In fact, the original Blob is probably the first melt movie, hence the genetic tie to street trash. There's also the Japanese film The H-Man that came out the same year as the Blob. That's 1958. And then there was The Incredible Melting Man in 1977, which upped the ante in gore. A young Rick Baker created the melting effects in that movie. But street trash is in a whole different league with gore. This movie was released unrated, as it would have never gotten an R, and that's not just because of the gore, which is plentiful. Street trash is a mean-spirited horror comedy that relishes in pushing your buttons and making you feel all dirty for watching it. And yet, it's such a weird and funny movie. It's simultaneously worse than you think and better than you think. The movie takes place at the border of Brooklyn and Queens in a much different New York City than exists now. This super politically incorrect universe is filled with the homeless, winos, and junkies, and the liquor store owners that provide them with cheap, nasty booze. And that's all there is. In Street Trash, a liquor store owner finds a case of cheap wine called Tenafly Viper. It's 60 years old and has gone bad, but he sells it to the winos anyway. And the wine didn't just go bad. Whatever live yeast were in that cheap fortified wine mutated over 60 years. When someone drinks Tenafly Viper, they melt in spectacular fashion, or they explode. And the goop they leave behind is highly corrosive. In a way, they become Tenafly Viper. The drink drinks them. What's creepy is that word gets out on the street that this stuff might be dangerous or poisonous, and some of the winos can't wait to get their hands on it anyway. They're looking for a buzz of oblivion, and they get it. The melting sequences are spectacular and extremely surreal. There's very little blood, considering we're talking about bodies melting. When people melt, they ooze purple and green and yellow gunk, and their bodies stretch like they're made from dough. They look like bizarre sculptures or water fountains. They bubble into puddles that still have human faces. It is strangely and unexpectedly horrible beautiful. And Street Trash started a string of melt movies like Slime City, Biomelt, and Body Melt, none of which are better than they sound. Okay, so Street Trash might be too lowbrow for you. Let's go a little more highbrow with Larry Cohen's social satire horror film, The Stuff. As a kid growing up in the 70s and the 80s, I got to see the start of what was to be known as the health craze. Notice I said health craze, not health movement. The health movement was a bunch of people wanting to get healthy, and they exercised. The health craze was a bunch of people who wanted to look healthy. And they jumped on any radical diet, and they bought all the miracle foods, and they drank all the miracle cleanses. Strangely enough, many of those people were also doing large amounts of cocaine, so it seems like this health thing was going to have diminished returns. At the heart of the craze was an obsession with a body image, not health. People wanted to keep their indulgences, but look good doing it. And that's the world The Stuff takes place in. The movie starts with The Stuff, a white, yogurt-like substance bubbling from the earth. All natural, straight from Mother Nature, right? It's tasted and tested, and instead of tasting like yogurt, it's sweet like ice cream. It's also found to be very addictive. So, of course, it is immediately marketed and sold to the public like ice cream. It's advertised as sweet, creamy, and filling with 0 calories. The jingle for The Stuff says, "Enough is never enough." Of course, The Stuff is a living creature. It is a parasitic and possibly sentient organism that gradually takes over the brain. It pumps up the pleasure centers in the brain so you don't notice when it takes over. The first stage is that you become a mutated thing like a zombie who wants to spread the stuff to other people. The final stage is that the stuff eats you from the inside out. In the end, you're an empty flesh husk. And everything that was inside, now it's just more of the stuff. You are what you eat. So who will our heroes be to save us from the stuff? A group of skeptical advocates or investigative reporters? Not in this movie. Our heroes are a corporate espionage agent and a junk food king. The espionage agent was hired by the ice cream industry because the stuff is crippling them. Both he and the junk food king are there to save profits, not people. I told you this was a satire, folks. The stuff skewers the health craze and the growth of fast food, as well as public apathy and corporate greed. But the movie also tapped into a real anxiety back in 1985, and one that is still relevant today. What is in our food? What does natural mean when the word natural becomes a marketing tool? Can we trust that the corporate world puts our health over their profits? Now, the stuff was based on a real health food that was just starting to gain popularity. When I tell you what it was, it will show you how much times have changed. It was live culture yogurt. Cohen combined live culture yogurt and cocaine, two popular white substances, to make his monster. Believe it or not, some people were very skeptical and very suspicious of live culture yogurt. You were willfully putting live bacteria into your mouth. Was this safe? Has this been tested? This was a time that, if you asked for non-pasteurized milk, people thought you were nuts. You'd have to go to a farm and suck on a cow teat. This was a time when the public didn't know good bacteria from bad bacteria. The word bacteria meant dirty. It meant disease. It was all bad. This is what my dad said about live culture yogurt. People are paying big money to eat spoiled ice cream. So, in the United States, we will be gathering friends and family to our dinner tables for the annual Big Pig Out. And perhaps, when you are cutting into that turkey or ham or pot roast, you might have a thought in the back of your head. Was this turkey injected with growth hormone? Or, on the other side of that same coin, did anyone check the soil where my free-range natural turkey ate to make sure there's no soil-based pathogens there? What the hell is that cranberry sauce that's shaped like a tin can really made of?
Happy Thanksgiving!
If you have those thoughts, and if that happens, think of me fondly. And thanks for listening to my show. I'd love to hear back from you. You can email me directly at scott@hellbentforhorror.com. And I've also updated my Hellbent for Horror website, hellbentforhorror.com. You can download every episode directly from there, read any newsletters, and you can go to any of my social websites and emails all from the homepage. You can IM me on my Facebook page at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and you can find me on Twitter at hellbenthorror. A lot of the great conversations I have with fans happens on Twitter at hellbenthorror. Now, for you, the listeners of Hellbent for Horror, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/hellbentforhorror. If you like the show and you're curious about audiobooks, sign up for the service through Hellbent for Horror. It helps make this podcast sustainable for me. I thank you in advance. And thank you for listening, folks. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can now subscribe to the Hellbent for Horror podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Player FM, and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please consider writing a review on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play. It really helps. Till next time, stay hellbent.